All right, let's jump right in. We're going to talk about a legal concept so powerful, it can literally tear up a billion-dollar promise in the blink of an eye. It's called force majeure.
I want you to imagine this, a huge, ironclad deal. You know, the kind that takes months to negotiate. Now just picture it, completely falling apart because of one single event that nobody saw coming. That's the world we're diving into today.
And look, this isn't some dusty old legal theory. No, this is happening right now. You've probably seen the headlines, right? Disruptions in major shipping lanes like the Strait of Hormuz. And suddenly, huge companies are making this really drastic legal move. This is where the chaos of the real world smashes right into the tiny print of a contract.
Okay, so that crisis in the Strait, that's our perfect real-world trigger. It's the perfect way for us to get a handle on this pretty complex idea. Which brings us to the big question, right? You see this term, force majeure, thrown around in the news, but what does it actually mean? Well, let's break it all down.
And honestly, a big clue is right there in the name itself. So let's figure out what superior force is all about. Okay, so here's the basic breakdown. Force majeure. It's French, and it literally means superior force. And that's exactly what it is. Think of it like an escape hatch built right into a contract. It frees people from their promises when some totally crazy, uncontrollable event happens.
But, and this is a big but, it can't just be any little problem. Oh no, the bar for this is incredibly high. We're talking about something often called an act of God. It has to be something genuinely unforeseeable, totally out of your control. And here's the kicker, it absolutely cannot be your fault. You can't claim force majeure because of your own mistakes or negligence.
You know, sometimes the best way to understand something is to look at what it isn't. And force majeure is definitely not your average breach of contract. See, a breach of contract, that usually comes from something you could have controlled. Maybe you were negligent. Force majeure? That's triggered by the exact opposite. The completely uncontrollable stuff. We're talking wars, pandemics, massive natural disasters. That difference? It's everything. Okay, so let's say you think you're facing one of these superior forces. What happens next? Well, you can't just declare it. There are rules to this game. Let's walk through how you actually invoke the clause. So what kind of events even count? Well, you got the classic examples. Things like wars, and hey, that brings us right back to our example with the Strait of Hormuz, or huge natural disasters like earthquakes. Even things like terrorist attacks, epidemics, and major riots. These are the big, society-shaking events that these clauses were literally written for.
And again, you can't just throw your hands in the air and yell, force majeure. It's a very specific formal process. You've got to notify the other party right away. You have to explain exactly what happened. You need to point to the specific clause in your contract that allows for this. And this is so important. You have to prove you did everything in your power to lessen the impact. You can't just sit back and do nothing.
All right, so let's say you've done all that. The clause is successfully invoked. What happens then? What's the aftermath for the contract? Well, it's not always as simple as just tearing up the contract. Nope, there are a few different ways this can play out. About half the time, the goal is just to delay things. You know, press pause. That makes sense, right? It helps keep a good business relationship alive. In other cases, maybe 30% of the time, the parties might decide to revise the terms, adapt to the new reality. And then you have the most extreme option, canceling the contract altogether. That only happens about 20% of the time, and it's really the last resort, for when things are just impossible.
Okay, let's zoom out for a second. Because this whole idea, it doesn't exist in a bubble. It's actually part of a much bigger, fundamental tension you see all throughout contract law. And here it is. It's this epic legal tug-of-war. On one side, you have this ancient core principle of law called pacta sunt servanda. It's Latin, and it just means agreements must be kept. It's the absolute foundation of all contracts. But then, on the other side, you have force majeure, the great exception. It's the law's way of throwing its hands up and admitting that, hey, sometimes stuff happens. Sometimes reality is just more powerful than any piece of paper.
And it's really important to remember, this isn't some universal rule that works the same everywhere. Oh, definitely not. How it's applied can change a lot depending on where you are. A great example is India, where this whole idea is actually written into their main contract act all the way back from 1872. And that law has its own specific rules and interpretations.
So all of this leaves us with a really fascinating and kind of urgent question for the world we live in now. You think about it. With pandemics, massive supply chain shocks, constant geopolitical instability, are these so-called extraordinary events really that extraordinary anymore? Or are they just the new normal? Is the great exception to the rule actually slowly becoming the rule itself? Definitely something to chew on.